you ever see Wet Hot American Summer? You know when they go to town?
No.
They go
Nope.
into town? Okay, well, first of all, terrible mistake. Both of you should... Wet Hot American Summer is a fantastic movie that is a cult classic. And with the two of you, I understand we're above pop culture. This is not pop culture. This is canon event. You should be watching Wet Hot American Summer specifically for the Paul Rudd cleanup cafeteria scene and also the "Are you going to town?" Homework.
I probably won't watch it, but I'm looking at it and I might.
I'm deeply offended. Yes.
Here's my struggle with pop culture stuff. There's so many shiny objects that I just feel like I can't keep up with it all and stay focused.
Well, that's why I'm clarifying that this isn't a shiny object. This is a canon event.
That's also why I am unavailable most of the time, so that I do not get distracted by shiny objects to the point you could consider it a syndrome.
Oh my God.
I actively avoid distractions because I am distracted by default.
Welcome to No Clear Answers, where we explore the common challenges all humans, creators, and leaders face, and we break down preconceived notions of common self-help ideas. We are your hosts. I'm Ricky Goldenberg.
I'm Justin Mulvaney.
And I'm Dr. Corey Wilkes.
Hey, briefly, I didn't even tell you I was going to do this. Surprise, surprise, motherfuckers.
Do it.
Well, one, as always, if you're a fan of the show, if you're listening, we always appreciate your following on your favorite platform, you giving us a 5-star rating, you liking the podcast, you subscribing. But I have a specific request from you all, actually. We recently have a team has been talking more and more about the direction of the podcast, our positioning, and the type of content we want to be doing. And if you're listening and you're a fan of the show, I would love to hear from you. We would love to hear from you. What topics do you want to hear us talk about? We're not on socials yet. We're presently working on that. But we have an email, which is noclearanswers@gmail.com. So the show title, noclearanswers@gmail.com. Please pop that open. Put whatever you want in the subject line. Actually, put the name of your favorite host in the subject line. It should be Justin. And write in the 1 to 3 topics that you would love to hear us talk about. And that would mean the world to us. Do it.
Otherwise, we're just going to keep coming up with the shit we want to talk about. Just sitting in a little echo chamber.
Well,
literally.
We might not do it, to be clear, but I'd love to know what you want us to do.
Oh.
Yeah, only if it's a good idea.
Yeah, if it's a bad idea, we're going to call you out and we're going to say it was a bad idea. And then we're also going to share everybody your name.
And address.
And email address as well.
No, physical address.
Physical address? We're going to dox you.
And bank account number.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we
come
all
up with
have
good
the skill set to do that. Definitely.
100%.
I am 100% prepared to do that level of research.
So I have a question. Today, this isn't a question, this is a statement first. It'll be followed by questions. Today we're going to talk about something that I think every entrepreneur and everybody else, really, who tries to build something worthwhile struggles with, which is shiny object syndrome. Okay. So today we're going to be talking more specifically about how shiny object syndrome interacts with entrepreneurship and other creative endeavors. Okay. But it should be applicable to most people. So first off, all of us by definition are entrepreneurs. We know a lot of entrepreneurs. And we've all, I think, to some degree, struggled with shiny object syndrome. So to kind of start off today's discussion, what is shiny object syndrome to you?
I'm going to answer 2 ways. I'm going to answer to me and to Wikipedia. Shiny object syndrome, when you experience it, either in yourself, in a leader, or in somebody else's, it's usually just a habit of consistently jumping to the next thing. Usually it's a trendy thing or a hip thing, but it's actually not always a trendy or hip thing in my experience, but it's always jumping to the next new hot thing that you feel like is going to get you to where you want to go without really seeing the present thing all of the way through. The Wikipedia definition, which I actually really like, and it I was going to share my screen, but I think it's going to require me to do a whole song and dance, so you're not going to get my screen shared here. But the Wikipedia definition looks something like: shiny object syndrome is the situation where people focus undue attention on an idea that is new and trendy, yet drop it in its entirety as soon as something new can take its place. Shiny object syndrome is a pop culture psychological concept where people focus on a new and fashionable idea, regardless of how valuable or helpful it may ultimately be. While at the moment it seems to be something worth focusing one's attention upon, it is ultimately a distraction, either a personal distraction or something that is done intentionally to distract others. This is probably the most important line of it for me. People who face a fear of missing out are especially susceptible, as a distraction of shiny objects in themselves clouds judgment and focus. And I really like that when I went and Googled it, because I do think if we're going to do this conversation around shiny object syndrome justice, it does highlight, I do think we need to address fear of missing out, because I think they're very closely linked with each other.
Yes, and all those things. I think a lot of shiny object syndrome is, getting distracted, getting excited by the start. You get a lot of energy, you feel really fired up, you're super engaged. And the thing that most of us struggle with, which is even moving away from the shiny object syndrome, but the follow through is the real detriment around shiny object syndrome, is that we're often so focused on starting and getting that fire that begins that we realize that fire is not necessarily sustainable to complete the concept. And so, yes, fear of missing out, really big component of shiny object syndrome. And I also think there's a complexity around maintaining like motivation and discipline and continuing to work through something when it no longer has the glittery excitement of the beginning. And you're like, shit, this, like, once you start learning what's really going to have to happen behind the details. And I think, especially in entrepreneurship, this comes up a lot. And also in leadership, this comes up a lot. I would think, Justin, you probably have a lot of examples of this too, but I've seen that oftentimes as you get more senior, there's a little bit of chasing the dream. And that's a lot of shiny object syndrome for me. Corey, tell us what we got wrong.
Well, one, shiny object syndrome isn't a real fucking syndrome, right? Like it's nothing diagnosable, right? It's just a made up fucking term.
Would you call it bullshit?
To call it a syndrome, yes, because a syndrome implies it's something like pathological or medical or some other kind of shit. So that is complete bullshit. It's just a made up fucking term. But shiny object syndrome to me is effectively when you constantly chase novelty. Okay. And, we hear things like, variety is the spice of life and all this shit. And all that's true, right? And I'm not going to talk about, quote unquote, like cheap dopamine and shit because, one, I'm not a neuroscientist. And two, I think that conversation around shiny object syndrome and FOMO and all these other things are just you chasing dopamine, kind of reduces you to just a vessel that is fueled entirely by electrochemical activities that have no meaning or no basis in existence or anything. And I think that is just, reductionist, and I don't like it. I think you are much more than your brain chemistry. So I don't fuck much with brain chemistry shit. Okay. Of course, dopamine and serotonin and all these other fucking neurochemicals play a part in this, but that I'm not your psychologist for that. That's not the kind of psychologist I am. But we chase novelty. We are wired to chase novelty to an extent. Okay. The issue with shiny object syndrome and how it trips most people up is that we chase novelty to the point that as soon as something begins to get difficult or boring, which everything eventually feels hard or feels boring. But as soon as it feels hard or boring, you bail. That is where it becomes highly problematic for a lot of people. Because a lot of people, again, entrepreneurship, leadership, hobbies, anything, if you have this unrealistic expectation that the way you feel about something in the beginning is how it has to continue to feel in order for it to be worth continuing to do, is a recipe for failure, right? Even something like we think about like relationships. There's this thing in relationships called NRE, new relationship energy. It's specifically a term used more with like polyamory and things. My doctoral research was on poly and shit. So you see this really, really frequently. And if you've ever, I mean, all of us have been in relationships for a minute, but when we were in new relationships, everything is exciting, right? But then eventually you're like, oh, fuck, we had an argument. Oh, can we fart around each other now? Like, I've, smelled their fart. Well, it's not nearly as exciting now, right? Like, whatever. Things can begin to get difficult. They can start to get boring. They can start to like just the shininess wears off. Okay. A lot of people can have shiny object syndrome in relationships because they constantly chase that newness. It's the same thing in hobbies. It's the same thing in business. It's the same thing in any worthwhile endeavor. We chase that novelty and we expect the feeling of that novelty to continue, to never dip. And just nothing in life maintains that pace and that level of excitement. Absolutely nothing. You can mainline fucking meth and eventually meth just doesn't feel as good. Like literally did addiction treatment. I know a lot of people that are like, look, meth just eventually doesn't feel as good anymore. Like and nothing feels better than meth, apparently. Okay. Supposedly. I haven't taken it, but it's what I hear. So if you're chasing that feeling, you're never going to commit to anything. And that's the real issue we're talking about today, of how shiny object syndrome gets in our way. Okay. So when it comes to shiny object syndrome, specifically with entrepreneurship and other endeavors like this, why is it so common?
There's a fundamental skill set for entrepreneurship, in my opinion. Because entrepreneurship, let's talk very specifically about what entrepreneurship is, which is, for me, at an abstract level, it's just going out into the unknown and attempting to create order out of disorder. Hey, let me try and create a value generating company where there isn't one. And that process, a necessary component of it, is trial and error. We have to go out, we have to try some stuff. We don't know if it's going to work. We're going to try it. We're going to see the feedback, and then we're going to act based on the feedback to try and make it more successful. So shiny object syndrome really nicely overlaps with, hey, we have to try some new stuff. Now, Corey, I think the point you just made really is a really profound one, which is shiny object syndrome is, if we really get just down into the human level, is really like, hey, I'm chasing a feeling very frequently, right? It's the feeling I get when I'm in novelty. Which, one, a lot of people who get into entrepreneurship are the type of people who chase extremes because they're willing to be on that ride. And secondarily, in my experience, both myself, the people I work with, I'm willing to bet a lot of money, you too. When you know something's working, it is a felt sense. Now, there's actually data, but there is an embodied experience like, ooh, this is working, excitement, like energy moving forward. And so I imagine that it's like the feeling of, hey, this is actually working, lives very closely to the excitement of, hey, let's jump on a new thing and see if it's going to work and get the early feedback. In fact, there may be early signs with all these things that it is working. And then, like Ricky said, we get bored and we can't see it through in the actual thing, in the actual attempt we're making to the next set of successes. And so I think shiny object syndrome is like a very natural way to short circuit this whole problem or this whole process of, let me try something, see if it works, be in when it's not working, and then get to where it's working again. Instead, we just keep hopping, looking for that feeling, even though the feeling is a weak substitute for the real hit of like, oh, I've actually built something here that's real.
Ricky, you got something?
I'm thinking about it. I feel like one of the and Justin, you said this really well, right? Like shiny object syndrome. It has connective tissue to individuals who become entrepreneurs. I think also something that we're describing is that, and I know we'll get more into detail here, is that shiny object syndrome is intoxicating and it's exciting. And when we're building something out of nothing, we need that. We need to harness it. I think one of the best things that someone told me, because I worked for a bunch of startups, and something that they would say is that the person who runs the company needs to be the best salesperson. They need to be the dream seller. They're the dream seller. That's who they are. That's who builds the company. They're the person who's sort of creating this intoxication, this excitement, this feeling of, oh, I'll miss out. The FOMO comes up that if I don't participate in it, I'm like missing the shooting star. And that's the person who has to start the company, right? Because you need a lot of people that are going to jump into the unknown with you. And so if we can harness that shiny object syndrome, it's new, it's fresh, it's exciting, it's creative. And then you bring people in, you put them on their seats in the bus, and they kind of help you drive forward. There's a fresh feeling in that. And I think it makes sense that entrepreneurs will feel that a lot. I think another reason why it happens with entrepreneurs is because in many ways, being an entrepreneur can end up being a solo act in some ways. It is sometimes difficult to know, am I doing the right thing? What does good look like? How long is it going to take to figure out if something is working or not working? And that can be exhausting to kind of hold on and wait for the tail end. Whereas that feels like maintenance. It feels like I'm waiting and I'm twiddling my thumbs. So when you pair that activity with someone who's pure energy, it feels better to be doing something new, trying something on, getting excited, bring in new ideas versus hanging out in the curiosity of let's try this new thing and let's sit with it. Sitting with it is really uncomfortable for someone whose entire existence is around getting that new, exciting, dreamlike idea, being able to sell it, feeling supercharged up. It's kind of one of the reasons why a lot of times the founder is not the CEO of a company. A lot of times founders depart and they bring in someone else to actually run the company because they like coming up with the idea versus executing continuously on the idea. It gets boring. Whereas like with entrepreneurs, there's people who call themselves serial entrepreneurs. And those are people that are like, I like starting stuff. And so I think there's just this connective tissue between the energy of those who are usually in the entrepreneurial space and also the nature of entrepreneurial work, which is that it is hard to stay in it, especially when you might have competing information coming in. If I'm bringing in funding, if I have advisors, if I have a team, it's this idea of trying to maintain that level of energy. And one of the ways to do that is to keep bringing in new.
Yeah, I like the difference between VC and bootstrapped entrepreneurs because there are differences, right? And how shiny object syndrome can kind of show up. For me, entrepreneurship fundamentally comes down to identifying problems and creating solutions to those problems. That is what entrepreneurs in any industry fundamentally do. You say, here's a problem. Let me come up with a solution to solve that problem. Which is why, there is unlimited freedom as an entrepreneur. The issue is there are an infinite number of problems to solve and an infinite number of ways, solutions to create for those same problems. Okay. Entrepreneurs tend to be naturally creative and curious, which is a double-edged sword, right? Because it can fuel you to identify problems that most people don't even register are a problem / a problem that is solvable and then providing a unique solution to that. Okay. But that also means you can easily get trapped into this cycle of constantly chasing new problems to solve with new solutions, right? There's also anecdotal overlap. I don't know if there's any actual empirical evidence to support this. Honestly, don't really give a shit if there is or not. I'm also not that kind of psychologist, but there tends to be a lot of anecdotal overlap with entrepreneurship and ADHD, or at least ADHD, hyper-divergent cognition symptoms. So you have this group of people, this cohort of hyper curious, hyper creative, always thinking about different problems, different ways of solving them. And then you give them the ability, the freedom, basically, to hang themselves with it, right? Of like, I can solve any problem I want. I can come up with any solution. I can always find a problem. If you can keep that reined in, you can build incredible things. But what frequently happens, especially in like not even like the entrepreneur space, but less seasoned entrepreneurs, they're constantly chasing something else. They're constantly pivoting before they reasonably should have been pivoting, right? Like there's this whole debate of like when to pivot and when to persevere, right? Like in the Lean Startup by Eric Reyes, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. The Lean Startup, they talk about it there. A book I just started, The Dip with Seth Godin. He's kind of talking about that too. Like, when do you quit? When do you stick? When do you pivot? When do you persevere? That kind of thing. And it's really easy for entrepreneurs to just constantly pivot. And then 5 years have gone by and you haven't gained traction with anything because you're constantly chasing something else, right? Which kind of leads into the next piece of.
I want to piggyback off of the last thing you said, Corey, which is we're talking about this and I noticed a voice came up in me that was like, I don't think this is true for all entrepreneurs, which then makes me go, okay, well, what about a certain subset of entrepreneurs makes shiny object syndrome so common? And my experience is, this is bootstrap versus venture back versus whatever. There's a subset of entrepreneurs who really get into their entrepreneurship because it's a calling, because there's a purpose, because there's something pulling them. There's like a real mission there. And my experience is people who are really core on mission tend to have less shiny object syndrome because there's something outside of what I'm going to juxtapose this is, which is their own egoic gratification of building something. In my experience, shiny object syndrome is common in a specific type of founders, which the reason I go to a certain subset of venture-backed founders who are doing the venture-backed game because they feel like something is missing and their ego is looking to fill what's missing by getting a ton of wealth, getting a ton of status, being really successful. And there's this almost manic energy that comes up with that vain ambition where they're trying to shortcut their way to that. And that's where shiny object syndrome comes in, they're looking for a shortcut.
I don't know. I had a response, which was, I don't think it's necessarily VC versus bootstrapped. I think it's more the type of entrepreneur, which is that I'm building this thing because this problem is so innately important to me. It's aligned with my mission and my drive. I believe that this needs to be in the world. Those are the entrepreneurs that it's a little bit more tricky in terms of when do you persevere versus when do you quit, actually, which could be an entire different discussion. Whereas I think there's some entrepreneurs, similar, Justin, what you're saying, slightly different flavor, which is that it's not about the process, it's more about the outcome, right? Like, I want to build stuff so I can like sell it. It's sort of like they're more focused on like the exit and like the next thing that they're going to build. And there's a certain energy behind that. But oftentimes they're looking for a problem to fix, not necessarily because they want to fix the problem, but because they think that the problem could be fixed and it will be financially solvent.
Yeah, that's it. There's
there's
some layer of egoic gratification that they want.
Yes. Like
it might not even be financially
drive.
solvent. It may be,
Yes.
I want to have a big status or something, but there's a they feel like something's missing and they're trying to self-reference, like fix that thing within themselves. It's not really about building the company or really solving a meaningful problem.
Yeah, slightly different flavor.
Yeah.
No, agreed.
And also,
go ahead.
I was going to say, this is also, when I think about shiny object syndrome, and I know we're talking about it with regards to entrepreneurship, which makes sense because there's a subset of entrepreneurs that are really contained in this space. But I also really firmly believe that shiny object syndrome exists. I mean, Corey, you mentioned it. Shiny object syndrome exists and is pervasive in other areas, right? There's leaders who you have worked with them, right? That they're a manager and they're constantly showing up with a new idea. And they're like, oh, now we're going to work on this. And you're like, okay, but why? And so it's not necessarily only entrepreneurs. I think that it's also individuals, right? Have you ever had that friend who's like, oh, I'm going raw vegan. And you're like, what? Wait, what? And like, you don't know why, but then next week they're eating duck. And you're like, what are the rules? So I think that shiny object syndrome isn't necessarily tied only in the entrepreneurial space, which I know we're not saying that, but I do think that even if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm not an entrepreneur, or like, you may still be experiencing shiny object syndrome around within you or someone else. It just might look a little different. My basic point is like, even if you're not an entrepreneur, you're probably experiencing this in some way. And
yeah. And my thing is, and we'll go more into this a little bit later as far as strategies and things to overcome it. And when we see it less as a liability, right? Because I agree there are types of entrepreneurs who more so struggle with this and those who less so, right? I was just talking specifically about like when it is a problem, here are situations when and how it becomes a problem, right? Which kind of leads me to my next point. What, as far as specifically, how does shiny object syndrome hold a lot of entrepreneurs back? Like, what does that actually look like when we believe shiny object syndrome is the culprit?
Well, I'm reminded of both a client I worked with and our hacks episode. Because in my experience, a lot of, especially in entrepreneurship, when somebody's really suffering from shiny object syndrome, they're trying to hack their way to success, whether it be financial status or whatever. And the end result of hacking like that is you actually have no foundation that you're standing on at the end of the day. You haven't really built a base of learning. You haven't really built a base of relationships. But really, for me, it's learning. You haven't really learned anything. All you've learned is all these different trendy things haven't worked, but you've never actually sat down and been with the process of taking an idea from start to finish, whether the finish is, hey, we really have high conviction this isn't going to work, so let's shut it down. Or, hey, we've learned a lot, and here's the limits of this thing. Here's where we think it can go. Here's where we can't. So I think one is it just shortcuts a fundamental learning process, and you don't actually have anything at the end of the day. And I'm just, this very much happened with a client that I worked with where they had shiny object syndrome like you wouldn't believe. I actually, Corey, there's a question I know it's on the docket, which is what experiences do we have? And I won't go all the way into it. But I almost didn't know how to work with this person because they had such extreme shiny object syndrome, and they just were grabbing for new things so quickly, but never seeing anything through, where like it was apparent to me that years of their life had gone by, and at the end of it they looked back and they had almost nothing for it. There was no sense of completion. There was no real learnings other than I've just jumped around everywhere. And so the real cost for me is back to that first point, which is at the end you look and you haven't actually built anything. You've got a set of Legos spilt across the floor behind you, but you have no structures that you've really built.
ultimately, I think the complexity around it is that it puts you in a position of being reactive rather than reflective. You're constantly in response to what's happening around you and getting pulled along rather than creating moments in time to say, what am I learning? Why am I doing this? How am I planning ahead? And I'm not saying anyone who has shiny object syndrome, we need to get you a fucking 2024 planner. It's more recognizing that the danger of shiny object syndrome is this kind of, maybe manic is too strong a word, but it's a really reactive, responsive experience and if you work in a team, it's really, really exhausting. If you've worked with someone who has shiny object syndrome, who's constantly changing the game and you can't really get a footing on it, it's not a productive way to move forward. And I think that's where it can get really complex, right? It puts you in this position that you're reactive, we're not being strategic, we're not being thoughtful, we're not creating time to reflect or learn or make change. And it also can be pretty exhausting to work with someone like this because they might struggle with the idea of slowing down to speed up. This is in the most extreme version of shiny object syndrome. A little shiny object syndrome, which I'm sure we'll talk about, can be really good. It can be energizing. It can be exciting. It can help focus on what lights you up. But if you're existing solely in that space of, ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that? It's an exhausting use of energy that's not necessarily harnessed in a productive, thoughtful manner.
At its absolute worst, especially in entrepreneurs and tech, at the end of it, you don't even have subject matter expertise because frequently you're jumping between different technologies is the way this works in tech. And so at the end, you can say a whole lot about you can say very little about a whole lot of things. And so again, I just come to this point of at the end when I see people with real shiny object syndrome, it's like, what do you have at the end of it?
So, I work with a mix of, entrepreneurs, founders, and content creators, right? And those are not mutually exclusive, right? You can be a lot of successful creators are entrepreneurs, right? At the end of the day, their business models may just be a little bit different, but especially with creators, I see this a lot because they bounce between niches, right? This week I'm talking about this thing, and then in a couple of weeks I'm talking about this other thing, right? The the most egregious example I can think of that if you've been on Twitter or LinkedIn, you've seen this. All the current AI gurus a couple of years ago were crypto gurus, and then before that they were some other kind of fucking guru, right? They're just chasing trends. Now for them, they do it in a way that they share the top 10 AI apps, and then they were sharing the top 10 NFT projects before, and then they accrue a big audience, and then people just see, oh, they've got 200,000 followers. They must know what they're talking about. I'll follow them too. But they don't usually have a lot to show for it other than a vanity metric because they're always chasing trends, which is a shiny object to chase. Okay. They're always bouncing between niches. Okay. A lot of times creators specifically who struggle, and the reason they struggle is through shiny object syndrome, right? This is the lens, the filter I'm talking about. They're always putting out multiple courses or products in too many content buckets. They're constantly putting out, all these different types of content that are in no way related. There's no through line. There's no single, messaging, anything like that, right? They're just basically, in country terms, throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? And a lot of people I've seen, creators, entrepreneurs, whatever, and more so in the solopreneur space, because there's a lot more agility as a solopreneur early on. They'll go from drop shipping and white labeling, then they'll go some other D2C thing. Then they start doing web design. Then maybe they'll dabble in coaching, but then now they're a ghostwriter, and now they're freelancing for some other kind of shit. And it's just what the fuck do you do? What is it? And Justin, to your point, which I love, is they're effectively chasing hacks. They're chasing a way to try to game the system. They're trying to find just the guaranteed money, and basically fuck whatever the means are. I'm fine to do that as long as I get my bag, right? But then you end up at the point of either you get your bag, cool, you made money, frequently not much and not sustainably, or you have nothing to show for it. No traction, no nothing, no business. right? That is most frequently what I see that people struggle with. And it's just like, and and we'll get to this too, but like I can especially speak to myself. And I was talking to a coach the other day, and we were both just like, dude, I wish I could go back to me 3 years ago and just be like, look, motherfucker, just do this. Right. But I think to an extent, that exploration process is critical, right? Because we've all read business books that basically told us, look, motherfucker, find a thing and stick to it, and just stick to it and evolve and iterate enough for it to gain traction. And eventually we do that. But until we do that, we're like, okay, but what does that mean? Like, how do I know if this is the right thing to be doing or not? That, I think, is a fundamental thing with shiny object syndrome in entrepreneurship is once you get that feedback of this is working, then it is much simpler to be like, cool, then I'm going to focus on this. But when you're early on, you're not getting feedback one way or the other. Like like in research terms, like your N is maybe one. Like you have such a small sample size. You're like, I did all these different strategies, is marketing things and this, that, whatever. And 3 people bought. And then I did this other thing and nobody bought. It's like, well, did the thing with 3 customers, did that work? Does that mean it's working? It's like, no, not necessarily. So you're just constantly experimenting without guidance. And I think that is a fundamental piece of this shiny object syndrome puzzle.
It's also, Corey, what you're describing is there's an element that's like a little bit fear-based as well. Not necessarily even fear of missing out, but like fear of success there, which is that, well, how do I know if it's going to work? And it's like, well, you don't. And then you try it and you're like, and you still don't know. And I think that when shiny object syndrome is actually like curiosity and learning, then it's really productive. Then it's about, okay, let's try new things. Let's learn from them. Let's go a little deeper. Let's decide when the pivot point is. Then we're not even really talking about shiny object syndrome. Then we're actually talking about curiosity with experimentation and depth of knowledge. The complexity that we run into with shiny object syndrome is when we are not creating that time or space and we're sort of just jumping based on hacks or trends or what's loud, and trying to like game it a little bit.
What's lost in that, Corey, that I think your example really pointed to, like that thing if you went back to yourself 3 years ago and said, just do this. I don't think you wouldn't have been able to do it.
No, you still wouldn't listen.
Because, well, it's not that you wouldn't listen even for me, Rick. What it is there's a set of fundamental skills that you're, like, let's just use entrepreneurship. You're learning, like, how do I get people's interest? How do I understand what customers in a market want a response to or not? How do I learn what I'm uniquely equipped to do and what that makes me well to work with in terms of entrepreneurship, what my team is uniquely equipped to work with? Like, there's a fundamental set of meta skills that you're building when you see something through even to failure that are, in my opinion, necessary for success. And when we keep going through shiny object syndrome, you're not actually building the most important set of meta skills over the long term. And that's I think what I'm saying is, like, in the first 10 years of your career, you may get nowhere, but not go into shiny object syndrome. And at the end, you have a really great set of skills that are going to equip you to be successful. Versus I've seen people in the first 10 years of their career have a bunch of shiny object syndrome and even have some success. But because they didn't have the meta skills, it all fell apart at the end because they didn't actually know how to run a business at the fundamentals. And that, to me, is the most deep thing that's lost, especially in entrepreneurship, but even using the example of relationships and diet and like these health things. There's a set of fundamental skills of learning how to be in relationship, through conflict, through disagreement, of what works for your body, that if you're just hopping around all the time, you're not actually building the fundamental skills that matter over the long haul.
I think what's hard is that for folks who sort of suffer from shiny object syndrome is like, that sounds boring.
It is.
You know what I mean?
It is.
I was just talking today about stress reduction and I was like, hate to break it to you fuckers, but like, nothing here is going to be mind boggling because a lot of the activities are not a hack. It's like hacks is a really good example of an episode you all should listen to, but it comes up with that, which is like the non-boring stuff. The boring stuff is often where a lot of the learning and growth exists. And that's hard. That's hard to swallow as a pill, to be like, oh shit, I kind of need to get bored. I kind of need to be challenged in the depth of it. And I think that, I've probably talked about this before, but Pixar, their creative process, fantastic studio, right? And what they talk about a lot, they have an entire book around their creativity process, which is, creative process. It starts off really fiery and exciting. And then at this midpoint, you're like, what the fuck are we doing? Oh God, is this going to work? I don't know what's going to happen. Oh my goodness. What did we sign up for? Should we change everything? And then you move through it. You move through it and you still create something really fucking cool. And what they talk about at Pixar specifically is that it's not that we don't go through that messy part. We still go through it. The difference is that we have learned the skill set and understanding that messy part is part of the creative process. You will move through it. And so we don't necessarily even get faster at it. We just get better at understanding that I have to go through this messy, complicated, stressful experience in order to actually create something interesting at the end. I think most of us, Corey, you pointed to this in the beginning of the conversation, which is that most of us, when we get to that messy, funky space, we bail. It's scary. It's hard to start figuring out, am I learning anything? And if we've been flying by the excitement of the initial start of the creative process or the process in general, it is really hard in that space to be like, uh-oh, what am I doing? And especially if we haven't done it before, we don't know what the end could look like. Whereas if we have started to do it and we get better at that meta skill set, just like we start finding it. We got to get a little funky.
I do really like the concept of developing meta skills, right? And we'll get more into this. But I think that even when you explore a lot of different things, finding a through line, finding that quote unquote meta skill, that will take you a lot further, right? Because exploration is part of this. But the other part is finding your own benchmarks, right? Like knowing like, okay, by this point, based on whatever, then I will decide to continue down this path or to do something else. I think the thing that trips up a lot of people is they don't have that. So they just kind of blindly continue to do it. And then as soon as they get bored or it gets hard, they're like, oh, well, then this is my feedback that I need to do something else. For example, when I was in middle school, all the guys and some of the girls wanted to play drums, wanted to play snare drum in band class, right? It was either band or like choir or some other kind of shit. And so I wanted to do band, wanted to play snare drum. The teacher, who was really not that great, she was like, okay, too many of you all want to play drums. So I'm going to give you all a test, and basically an aptitude test to see if you can basically track rhythm. Only the people who pass will be allowed to try to play drums. The people who fail will just be put on trumpets. So we had a massive trumpet section. Like fucking massive.
Either way, your parents are going to be upset by the music that you are going to be playing. It's just drums or trumpet.
I like that you get cursed to the land of the trumpets if you can't cut it on drums. Wow, what beautiful! That's
it's perfect.
Just good.
Here's a horn.
And this is a discussion for another day of like how awful of a strategy that was and how you just crippled people's potential. But separate conversation, separate soapbox. I passed, so I was on snare drum. My issue as a fucking 12-year-old, 13-year-old was I just wanted to fuck off in the back with my friends. I liked drums, but I wasn't disciplined. I didn't give a shit. So as soon as the snare drum music started to get difficult, I was like, hey, can I do a different thing? She's like, okay, you can do bass drum. And like, I remember specifically, we were playing Louie Louie on bass drum, and it took 3 people to play the bass, which was like dun 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 dun, and it was just 3 people in a fucking line, and I'm just like, okay, I got to do 3. Okay, let me count. Back to them. Okay, dun dun dun, and we would just do that. As soon as the bass drum music got too complicated, I was like, I'm just going to play triangle. None of the pieces we played had a triangle part. And this other bitch who was on quad, she was like, Miss whatever, like, Corey's not doing anything. The teacher's like, leave Corey alone. As long as he isn't fucking up shit, just leave him alone. So like the teacher would just let me hit the triangle at random intervals just to keep me preoccupied, because I was a fucking menace in band. Okay. But it was very much this, as soon as it got hard, I was like, nope, I want to do something else. Oh, it got hard. Nope, I want to do something else. Until eventually I was just fucking off. I can't read music. I can't play music. As soon as I could drop band, I did. And then whoever could have, who may have loved to play, snare drums, I took their fucking place because I have a bass aptitude for rhythm, right? But that's the shiny object syndrome thing. I'm like, nope, I don't want to do this. I'm going to do something else. As soon as it isn't fun, I'm going to move to something that is more fun and that is easier, because we think if something is hard, I don't have the aptitude for it, and therefore I shouldn't do it. I should only do things that feel easy to me, that come easy to me. Because a lot of times in school, early on, that is how we are kind of shunted through the system. Okay. And I think for a lot of us, that really fucks us up later in life, right? Like, I was a smart kid, right? Like, I was in honors classes. They tried to skip me a grade, like whatever, right? Like I was in the upper echelon of all of my classes every time, graduated on stage, the whole thing, right? School was never hard for me. It just wasn't. Then I got to college, and largely college also wasn't really hard for me. The only time I really struggled was when I just didn't go to class for like 3 months, right? Just because I just didn't want to. And even getting my doctorate largely wasn't hard. As long as you just do the shit, it's largely not difficult. But then I got into entrepreneurship, and I was like, I've only ever done things that are easy to me. I sucked at math, so I didn't take more math classes. Psychology doesn't have much math. I sucked at this, so I just didn't do that. I did this shit over here that was easy. When people are like, hey, Corey, you should go to medical school. You'd be a great physician. I was like, I don't like chemistry, so I'm not going to fucking do it. I'm going to get this non-medical doctorate over here. And then I got a job where I could work with physicians, but not have to know medicine. And that's what I did when I was a behavioral health provider, a therapist. But when I got into entrepreneurship, that wasn't an option anymore. It was like, oh, you're not good at copywriting? Either you fucking learn it, or you make enough money to pay somebody else and hope they can do a good job. Oh, you're not good at accounting? You better figure it the fuck out until you can hire a CPA. You're not good at this? Figure it the fuck out. So suddenly, and even though, relatively my business is designed around my strengths, there are many weaknesses that I have had to learn to either shore up or outsource some other kind of way. But I think that habit of just do what's easy. As soon as something becomes boring, go to something else. As soon as something becomes hard, do something else. Always gravitate toward the easy, exciting thing really fucked me early on. At this point, I'm like, okay, shit's supposed to be hard. If it was easy, everybody would do it. And I've integrated that belief into my identity of this is supposed to be hard to an extent. The fact that it is hard, the fact that it is boring sometimes, that is your rite of passage as an entrepreneur. Can you persevere through the difficulty, through the boredom? Because 99% of people can't/won't. So if you want to be on the other side of that, you have to do what everybody else can't/won't do, which is push past the hard and the boring. That's what has helped me personally. Go ahead.
I I also think, oh man, I'm starting to think about ideas for us, but there's this other component which is this is not the representation that we see, right? What we see instead is the movie montage of like, I'm gonna get fit, and then it's like da-na-na-na-na-na, and they're like hitting the bag, and suddenly they've got like a six-pack, and like now they're fit. Or, when someone, you're only getting the LinkedIn version of look at this amazing thing that I've been getting done. And so I think not only is it common to have this idea of let's just do the things that we're good at and let's just take on the things that excite us in this moment, but we also are surrounded by the expectation that there is going to be immediate success and there isn't any kind of like complexity around it. And I think in reality, the movie montage is fucking bullshit, right? Like so much of the three of us have talked about exercise and fitness and all that stuff. It's like so much of it is just fucking time on feet and like doing shit that you're like, man, I don't really want to do this today and I'm going to have to do it. And that's a complexity here too, which is that the representation that we see out there usually glosses over those days or moments or experiences where you're like, I don't fucking know if this is working, or this is really uncomfortable and I am bored, or I'm feeling pushed outside of my zone of genius and I want to hang out where I know I'm good, but I can't do that if I want to keep doing this. And so part of what Corey is hitting for me in that is like, the struggle is real. Like getting a little bit more aware that there often is going to be that complexity. Ira Glass talks about this all the time, that usually start something because you're good at it, right? You're like, oh, I'm good at this. I, of course I'm tied to writing. Like I'm good at writing. And so I start writing. And then at some point you realize, oh, writing is actually really fucking hard. And I actually have to really work at the reason why I'm drawn to it is because I believe that I'm going to be good at it. But the experience of actually doing the thing is that, if I actually want to be as good as like the geniuses, if I actually want to be good at like the really incredible authors that I covet and I see, there's distance between that and where I am now. And we have to play with going from there to there is not A to Z. It's up and down. It's wiggling around. There's going to be days that you feel good. There's going to be days that we don't feel good. And that is a fucking lived human experience. Shiny object syndrome is really fun. It's fun to get like charged up and excited by doing the thing that you think is going to be exciting and it feels aligned with you. It's more fun than having to do the bullshit stuff. But the bullshit stuff is where the meta skills are built. And it's also where we learn how to fucking find grit.
Justin, you look pensive.
He does.
Yeah, I find myself going, because we're veering dangerously close to like self-improvement, like just see it through, just do the hard thing, which maybe that's the medicine for people who or really fall prey to shiny object syndrome. Let me totally out my inner experience. I don't totally get shiny object syndrome. It's never been my thing. And so, Corey, as you were sharing part of it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was just aware, like, I personally tend to fall on the other end of the spectrum, which is I will see things through and usually in retrospect go, wow, I persisted with that far beyond what I needed to persist with it. And so I think I'm both melding that with my inner experience and also kind of asking myself the question like, okay, well, what really is the medicine for someone with shiny object syndrome? I think part of it is, and I'm the real world example of this client I had, this was fully candid early in my coaching journey. And I had the thought that they were really struggling with shiny object syndrome, but I didn't back then. I was more in like ask questions, be supportive, rather than like really outing the judgment that was just like, hey, I make up, you're just jumping from thing to thing like wild here. And then it's not in service of you. So I think one piece of medicine for people with shiny object syndrome is they just need somebody to say, you're just jumping around to shiny objects. And if you're listening and you're wondering if that's you, just ask some people around you and ask them to be really honest, because I think that's important feedback. But yeah, I just over here, I'm like, what really is the medicine? Because I don't think it's as simple as you just got to grind through it. I think you have to be willing to be bored. I think for me, there's a question of before you hop to the next thing, can you articulate why you're leaving the thing you just did, right? Did you really complete it? Can you actually coherently go, here's why I'm giving up what I'm doing and why I'm leaping to this next thing? I think that's a good check, but I don't think the medicine is just push through.
Justin, I think that's really important because I think that, you know, through this discussion, there's a little bit of a flavor of like, just grin and bear it, just keep going. Like shiny object syndrome is bad. I don't think that's actually necessarily true. Like, I do think that shiny object syndrome can be very serving to you if you harness it as exciting and it is giving you new ideas that we can figure out how to cultivate. I think it's more around what do you do with that shiny object syndrome, right? If we're just being reactive, it might not be as supportive. But if instead we're leveraging it as a tool and actually as a superpower that we're able to sort of see opportunities left and right and start to figure out how do I delineate, is that when I go down versus not? That's where a lot of the skills come in, right? It's a superpower in many ways to be like, oh, I'm constantly having new ideas and excitement. I think the complexity is starting to learn, well, when do I depart from an idea? When do I really buckle down on an idea? What have I learned from that? And also recognizing when it's safe or not safe too. I think there's this component of, you know, if I'm constantly just jumping from project to project and it's impacting my ability to complete things or to stay focused or to participate in a relationship when a relationship gets hard, then that's a little bit maladaptive in some ways versus when instead we're leveraging it as, how do I get fired up? How do I get excited? How do I infuse new things, right? Like if I'm a workout junkie and I love trying new workout classes, technically that's shiny object syndrome, but it also means that I'm working out, right? Like one of the reasons why ClassPass was successful was because it banked on the idea of people wanting to try new types of workout classes. So if the meta skill is there, right? I want to exercise. Shiny object syndrome can be really supportive of that. If you're someone who's like, well, I get bored, that helps you stay excited. It helps you get in it, like innovative and interested. It's more around then what do we do with it? How do we decide how to engage with it? So I think it's important that like, I don't necessarily see it as always negative. It's more, it can get negative very easily.
So we're kind of getting into like strategies to overcome it, right? Justin, I agree as far as it can sound like just kind of grin and bear it. And I do think that is maybe step 2 or 3 or even 4 of at a certain point, you just have to embrace the idea of I'm going to have to eat shit and grind on this. Like there's no substitute for like work ethic, right? Like some things you can outsource, you can hire for whatever, but it's even, you know, Ricky talking about like exercising. I can't outsource my health, right? Like at a certain point, I have to do the fucking work, right? You can get lipo, you can take Ozempic, you can do whatever the fuck is going to be popular at a certain time because people always want the results without the effort, right? But it's sort of like in Harry Potter when you drink unicorn blood. It's like it's a half-life, a cursed life, right? Like you have to put in the fucking effort to legitimately get real results in whatever that looks like for you, right? You can kind of cheat, you can kind of hack to a point, but you'll never really get what you're looking for going that route. At a certain point, you do have to just eat shit and grind. Okay. However, that can be highly prescriptive of like just do it, just push through, right? The steps previous to that I think are very important and very infrequently talked about are probably around alignment, right? So shiny object syndrome, we talked about dopamine, we talked about chasing a feeling and shit. There's, you know, hedonism, right? And I think I've talked about this maybe a little bit, but hedonism is pleasure seeking, right? To be hedonistic or to be hedonic is you're chasing things that feel good. And as soon as things stop feeling good, you stop doing those things and start doing something else. Okay. The sort of the remedy for that is, so that term is called hedonia, right? Pleasure seeking. The remedy in my mind is eudaimonia. Okay. And eudaimonia is basically, is this worthwhile in the long run? Okay. So the difference between them, if I am chasing hedonia, pleasure for pleasure's sake, superficial pleasure, as soon as the thing I'm doing stops feeling good, I quit doing it. With eudaimonia, which you can substitute fulfillment for that word, on a day-to-day basis, it may not always feel good. Some days it's going to be hard. Some days it's going to be boring. Some days it's going to feel awful. But if in the long run, I believe this work is worthwhile to do, this path will pay off, I believe in the mission of this thing, then if you say, hey, Corey, are you having fun today? No, today is one of those days I'm just eating shit and grinding. Okay, but is this worth it tomorrow or in a year, in 10 years? Oh, 100%. I gain enjoyment from the mission overall, even if today it doesn't superficially feel good, right? So I think identifying a thing that you're willing to commit yourself to for the foreseeable future, I think that is a key beginning piece. And then once you have that reasonably locked in, then a follow-up step is, okay, now you got to eat shit and grind, right? You've decided what is worth dedicating yourself to an extent. You are flexible on how you get there. You're flexible on the methods. So that is when you're pivoting and you're adapting and you're iterating. But overall, this mission is relatively solidified. But how you get there is completely in flux based on the feedback, based on exploring and experimenting, right? Jerry Seinfeld, he was on the Howard Stern show or something. And one of the quotes he had that I really love, that I may or may not be butchering, is basically, your gift in life is when you find the torture you're comfortable with. Okay. And I love this because that writing is that for me, right? People will comment on my writing like, hey, I really enjoyed it. Hey, this, whatever. I'm like, thanks. Writing to me feels like belly crawling through broken glass. I tell people that all the time. Like it is excruciating for me to write. But at the same time, I can't not write. I am compelled to write. If I were to have to go 2 week for like a 2 week quote unquote vacation and I wasn't allowed to write, that wouldn't be a vacation for me. That would be a fucking chore. I write all day, every day. But when I get to the point of like, okay, I'm finishing an article, I'm finishing a piece, whatever, the process of putting this very vague idea that I think I can communicate effectively onto a page for other people to like understand is absolutely fucking excruciating. Like editing, formatting, like it's awful. But I do it because it is the torture I'm comfortable with, because I love doing it. Okay. It gets boring. It gets hard. But that to me is worthwhile because of my mission to help people build a life and a business aligned with their values, to succeed on their terms, right? To achieve their version of self-actualization, whatever term you want to put that on, to achieve the life they want. That is why I write. That is why I coach. That is why I do all my other shit.
Yeah. This is where Corey and I are different. I would not advise anyone persist in anything that reliably feels torturous to them. So like, just to offer an alternative perspective, because that may resonate with you or may not. For me, I don't think eat shit and grind. I would never tell anybody that I think they just need to eat shit and grind. Never. Would never come out of me. Now, the thing that I might say to somebody who's struggling with shiny object syndrome, and here's why. My experience with the people I've been with who have struggled with shiny object syndrome, it's not a work ethic problem. They will work hard and push when they're riding the wave of the novelty of a new idea. What much more of it is for me is they don't have the skill set of generating creativity into a pre-existing idea. They need something novel to come in, something new, some huge way to shift it up. For some reason, when you were speaking, the analogy came to me of like, it's like they start a pizza restaurant and then they get bored with the pizza they're making. And so they decide they're going to make hot dogs. And they don't have the skill set of going, well, how can we mix up pizza and see what happens? I know it's a silly analogy, but I do think this is the fundamental skill set of somebody with shiny object syndrome is they don't have the skill set of, hey, how do I inject new creative life into this thing that now I'm a little bored with, I'm a little frustrated. It's not working the way that I want it to. So how can you create creativity with that rather than running for an externalized set of creativity? So that's point number one for me with overcoming shiny object syndrome is if you notice you're getting bored with the current idea, it's not where you want to. One question is, well, how can I inject some new life into what's here rather than going elsewhere for it? I think the second question that pertains more to the founders I work with, I think the inherent thing with shiny object syndrome is, Ricky, you had this question, and there's a quote from a book I actually read recently called The Line Tracker's Guide to Life. It's actually an amazing book by this guy, Boyd Vardy. And the quote was, it's hard to know when the lesson is to persist and when the lesson is to let go. And I actually edit this to, you will not know. You can't know. The real thing is it's hard to decide when to let go and when to persist. And the inherent question here is, should I persist or should I try and do something new? Should I let it go? And a resource that I found really helpful, I would share my screen, I'll put it in the show notes, is the Conscious Leadership Group wrote this blog that was called, Are You Quitting or Are You Completing? And the idea being there's a way to quit an idea, which is to just right where it is without any self-reflection or anything, go, I'm just done with this. I'm done with it. I'm not going to do it anymore, which I think is frequently what happens to shiny object syndrome. We just drop what is without reflection and jump to the next thing. And CLG proposes there's an alternate way to do this, which is the idea of completing. And they have a few questions that they use to audit, hey, how complete are you? One is, have you kept all of the agreements you made and cleaned up all the agreements you've broken? Have you said everything that you have to say? Have you listened to everything that everyone around you has to say? Have you felt everything to feel? Are you still blaming anyone? Or have you taken responsibility? Have you faced everything there is to face? Have you learned everything there is to learn? And then, have you given what you came to give and gotten what you came to get? Now, you might not be yes to all those questions, but I find, especially in entrepreneurship, it's really useful to ask. Have I faced everything I've had to face? Have I said everything I had to say to myself, to my team? Have I felt everything? Have I fully listened? And these are just questions to be like, hey, have I put it all out there before I've made the decision to complete with this thing and go elsewhere? And that doesn't mean that it's not going to be uncomfortable. That doesn't mean it's going to be heartbreaking. But my experience, especially on teams, is if you say everything that you have to say and listen to everything that you have to hear and feel it all, making that decision usually becomes clear. Because either there's some new energy in saying everything and hearing everything, or there's the heartbreak of, hey, I don't think this is going to work and I'm going to drop it. And so I really think if I were working with somebody struggling with shiny object syndrome now, I would say before you drop anything and go anywhere else, audit these. Give yourself an audit. Actually reflect. Am I completing with this thing and consciously choosing to put it down, or unconsciously just dumping it and taking the leap to the next thing?
I really like that.
Yeah. Are we doing tactics? Are we in tactics?
I think we're here. Tactics and strategies. The one other thing I'll say too is if you find that you're a person who struggles with shiny object syndrome, a lot of great entrepreneur pairs are like the innovator and the operator. And so, especially if you're in a thing where you can partner and you're somebody who struggles with shiny object syndrome, and you either don't want to or haven't been able to chip away at it, just find somebody that's the opposite. Somebody with my issue who sees things too long, who's really an operator, who will see something through to the end. And that partnership, if you can figure out how to work well together, some of the best entrepreneurial pairs tend to have that kind of pairing.
Absolutely.
Ricky, do you have anything?
Do you want to go next or you want me to go next?
I can. So just kind of framing the question. Ways of potentially leveraging shiny object syndrome to be more of an asset than a liability. Okay. Because the obvious thing is, shiny object syndrome is problematic. It is more of a liability. Okay. But is it possible? And if so, how is it possible to learn to turn it into more of an asset for you? Okay. For me, I really like the overall concept that Daniel Vassallo kind of popularized, which is a small bets mentality. Okay. There are a lot of different versions of this, but he calls it small bets. Some people will create like 12 startups in 12 months or 12 projects in 12 months. And the overall concept is, how can I basically say, this month I'm building this thing, and by the end of this month, it will be self-sustaining so that I minimally have to maintain it. Okay. For example, that can be, maybe you can design like an MVP app. You can design a course. You can, potentially do like an ebook or something, right? Depending on the scope of it and things. Just little things like this. And then after that, it's finished. So you have hard parameters on it. And then it is out into the world. Okay. Because then at that point, so one that's allowing you to explore your own creativity and experiment. But then at the end of that year of 12 months, you have potentially 12 things, 12 data points that you can then go back and be like, okay, which of these is potentially the outlier as far as results? Well, let me go back to that one and double down. Okay. So if you're the type of person who just is compelled to constantly try out new things, that's fine. This is one route that you can leverage that propensity to doing. Another thing is, so in the YFC community, in my online coaching community, we've seen a couple people, one specifically, shout out to Jan, who is focusing on coaching what he calls Renaissance people or polymaths, these types of people who are multi-passionate, right? Meaning basically they just have shiny object syndrome all fucking day. Okay. The difference between these Renaissance or polymaths is they have the capacity to pursue multiple things. Key differentiator. If you do not have the capacity to do this, then it is purely shiny object syndrome. However, if you are capable of learning a language, learning an instrument, writing a book, doing this other shit, all reasonably within the same frame of time or time frame, then you have the capacity to do that, right? And that is, when we look historically at people who were polymaths, or they were called Renaissance people, Renaissance men, women, whatever, they had the capacity, right? Like, how the fuck was this person an astrophysicist and they played piano and they knew, 8 languages? Like, how is that possible? They had the capacity. Okay. If you have the capacity, finding ways of leveraging that and completing the tasks, completing the goals before you move on, that is a huge thing, right? The issue with shiny object syndrome is that you do not complete the thing before you move on to the next thing. If you complete it, well, now you're just collecting a fuck ton of skills, which is awesome. Okay. Because now these are distinct skills. These might be meta skills that will continue to compound with every additional skill you add to your repertoire, that is giving you more and more insights, more and more skills that significantly increase your likelihood of success with the next thing that you do. Okay. So keeping in mind your capacity, putting specific guardrails on of like, this month, this is my goal. Then when the month is over, I move on. This is what it means to complete this thing. That can be super, super helpful. And then one other thing I would say is learning to see it when you're doing the new thing, learning to see it as almost like an apprenticeship to learn this skill you currently lack that will be an asset in the future, right? That might mean working for somebody, or that might mean just being self-taught, right? Like when I went down the rabbit hole of copywriting, that was teaching me the meta skill of positioning and communicating things. So then when I wanted to learn storytelling for fiction, I was like, oh, this maps really well. The hero's journey maps reasonably well onto the pastor model of copywriting. Copywriting is just telling a story. Fiction is telling a story. Nonfiction is moving people toward the end, which has sort of a hero's journey arc to it. So every time I learn a new quote unquote skill, I'm actually compounding my overall understanding. And each one is an apprenticeship where I am learning a dedicated skill that I'm collecting toward the ultimate end of being more effective at my mission that I'm actually trying to accomplish long term. That's what works for me.
I have 3. The first one sounds very familiar to what Corey was saying. And that's okay. We can repeat it to let it land, which is for my 3, for folks who are navigating shiny object syndrome. The first one is creating shape around the shiny object, similar to what Corey was talking about. Let's get a little bit clear around what good looks like, right? I want to try this thing. I'm going to work on it for this long, or this is the goal that I'm going to hit, or this is the thing that I want to create. Basically applying it as experiments, right? Curiosity around the experiment that we're trying to accomplish here. Because otherwise what happens is that we continue to shift the goalpost, or we just ignore a goalpost and it's just out there. So basically starting to create some flavor and structure around the shiny object as if it's like a project, right? I have a project. This is how I'm going to work on it. This is how long it's going to take. This is how much I'm going to invest or spend on it, whether it's my time or money. What you're doing is starting to create guardrails, which you can then navigate and negotiate with if you're learning new information. But if we just go into it and we're chasing, there's not as much of an opportunity to ensure that we have stage gates. Basically, what you're doing is you're creating stage gates that help you assess, do I want to keep going? Do I want to switch? Have I given this my best effort? Have I gone with best effort? Have I learned something from this? And if the answer is I haven't learned anything, then we probably aren't done. So that's the first one. That's not necessarily grin and bear it. It's actually more just creating some shape around the shiny object. So rather than having 17 different projects running along, let's have some flavor around it. It can be really helpful. What information am I missing? What do I need to learn in order to make an informed decision versus feeling like I'm just jumping? A lot of times what happens with shiny object syndrome is that we have so many things happening that none of them get completed, that there's no real learning, that we don't have an opportunity for reflection. And then we're frustrated because we feel like, oh, well, I feel really indecisive. Decision fatigue has occurred. And it's like, of course it has. But spoiler alert, decisions occurred. The decision was to just kind of keep going without making a decision. So that's the first one, creating a little bit of shape around it. It's kind of what Corey was saying. It's kind of what Justin's saying. We're all kind of fucking saying the same thing. My second one is from Johan Ari, who wrote Stolen Focus, which is basically an entire book about like, why can't we focus anymore? Our human brains don't like it. But one of the things that he talks about in terms of increasing focus is kind of if you have too many tabs open, if you have too many projects open, what happens is that you jump from project to project every time it gets a little hard because your brain doesn't like it, right? So rather than dealing with the snare drum, I jump to trumpet, I jump to triangle. Like basically, I just keep jumping every time it gets hard, and it's easy because I have another project. So one of the recommendations that he has is basically stop having so many creative endeavors out there. Stop having so many projects at once. What Corey outlined of that, like startup per month, that could help you there, right? Saying like, I can only have 3 going projects, because otherwise what happens is that we jump every time we get uncomfortable. So we're closing some tabs. If that makes you feel anxious, you're in the right place. You need to close some fucking tabs. My last one is from Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit. I actually really like this one because it lets you keep all your tabs. If you were like, which is going with the one hard thing. Choosing one hard thing that you are going to grin and bear it, double down, focus in on, create some resilience and grit within it. And it can be something totally different than your project. I have found almost everyone that I work with who's an entrepreneur, because I often work with entrepreneurs too, everyone that I've worked with who's an entrepreneur or has their own solo like project, or they're a freelancer, like they basically have something that's kind of on their own journey. Almost all of them, it really benefits them to have a one hard thing, which is basically it can be a low stakes opportunity to push yourself through the discomfort of the boredom or the plateau in learning. It doesn't have to be work related. It doesn't have to be project related. It's actually choosing something that you're like, this is something that I'm just going to make myself keep working on it. And that could look like running, playing the ukulele. I have a client who plays the ukulele because of this. Playing the ukulele, which is like super weird. Learning a new language, learning how to cook, right? I have another client who decided that they wanted to figure out how to cook. So they started trying one recipe each week. Some of the recipes were good. Some of them were not good, right? And this is totally separate from work. Basically, what you're doing is you're creating a safe environment to fuck up. And you're creating the safe environment to have to work through when the novelty has worn off and shit is kind of boring. That week that you're like, I don't actually want to cook something new. It's like, nah, you're fucking cooking something new. You're still doing it. And that having a space that you can navigate the complexity around having to try something, even when we're maybe not feeling it, the novelty has worn off, we're kind of in the plateau of it, and we keep working at it, helps create that grit and resilience to recognize when am I in shiny object syndrome and jumping out because I got bored versus when am I jumping out because it's time to step away. The project is complete versus quitting.
I think a lot of the recipe of turning it into an asset, which I think we're kind of in this question now. There's one angle, like if I was working on someone with one-on-one where we would really get deep into when you're hopping to the next shiny object, what's going on internally, right? What are the thoughts, emotions, stories? There's one angle. I'm not going to try and do that right now, especially because it's a little foreign to me, right? Like Corey, you kind of have shared some of it, but I imagine there's a lot of angles. But I'm thinking of somebody I work with who, very brilliant leader, really injecting novelty is a superpower of theirs. And some of the work that we've done together is just creating internal and external checks and balances. So internally is, okay, I know that I have this. I know that I can chase novelty. I know that I can sometimes in that fall prey to shiny object syndrome. So when do I want to allow my pursuit of novelty to reign unfettered? Right? Maybe that's in creative brainstorming meetings. Maybe that's in bigger strategy meetings, right? Versus where do I want to check it a little bit more? In what context, inner context, is my shiny object syndrome not of service? Maybe when I'm afraid or things aren't going well. When is it of service? When things are going well and when we want to double down. And then having those conversations with the people around you. So you have some external checks and balances who can push back at you and let you know when they think maybe you're doing this in ways that aren't in service. And so if this is resonating with you and you think you suffer from shiny object syndrome, I would just say, hey, when do I think this is really helpful? And when do I think it's not? How can I create internal intentions and checks and balances? And how can I share this with important stakeholders around me so they can also serve as checks and balances to me? I think that's a really basic way of, if we're not going into the inner work and trying to deconstruct and crack the whole nut, to set up systems to help you with this being more asset than liability.
So I really like the idea of what you're talking about. Kind of made me think of this. The idea of using shiny object syndrome almost as like a guide of like, what could this be trying to tell you? Right? The fact that when you're on this path, you keep looking at other paths, you keep looking at other ideas. What is that trying to nudge you toward, or trying to whisper to you, try to like just make you question what you're currently doing, right? Because maybe it isn't shiny object syndrome itself so much as we need to inject more curiosity into our current workflow, because that curiosity is how we will find our unique angle, a potential new product that aligns with what we're trying to do, that we haven't considered yet because we've been so focused on this other thing, right? One, I really like that. And then the other thing I kind of see it as almost like a test of every time, because I do this myself. Okay. So I love exploring new ideas. I am, Jess, you're talking about like operator versus innovator. I am most definitely much more on the innovator side of I'm always thinking of ideas, right? And every time I learn about somebody else's business model, I'm like, oh, here is how I would do that. That's just how my brain works. But then my brain is like, oh, we could totally like, here's exactly what we would do. Like, here's the fucking beer brand company, the fucking coffee company, the this, the that. And it's like, all those seem cool. How would I do it? Oh, I would do X, Y, and Z. But then I have to say, like, okay, how does this compare to what I'm currently doing, to what I'm currently building? Is this just exciting and shining and new? Or is it potentially more aligned with what I want to do in this current chapter of my life and my business compared to what I'm currently doing? That allows me, when I ask that question, I can be like, no, I still have high conviction in what I'm currently doing. And I have higher conviction in it because I questioned it. Okay. Than if I hadn't questioned it at all. Right. And I really, really like that as a mental model of it's okay to expose yourself to these new shiny things so that you can ask, is what I'm doing still worthwhile? Because every time I ask that and I answer yes, I increase my conviction in what I'm currently doing because I know it is better for me than the other options out there, which means I have made the quote unquote right decision.
Corey, on this pointer point, I think it marries well with what I was saying before, which was I think shiny object syndrome could just be a pointer to I want some more creativity. I want to inject some more aliveness into this. And if, like you said, instead of routing that to let me do something entirely different, you can route that to, cool, am I still aligned with the path that I'm on? Yeah, great. How can I inject some more creativity into this path? What wants to be born and created right where I'm at rather than leaping somewhere else? I think those two things just marry so beautifully. There's a wisdom in it, but it's routing it in a way that really feels aligned, like you said, rather than is taking you for a ride all over the place.
I honestly think that most of the things we struggle with are trying to inform us or instruct us of something. Our responsibility is learning to see it as that rather than an obstacle. What is this trying to inform me? What is this trying to educate me about or instruct me about? Because if I only see it as an obstacle to be conquered, I miss the fucking lesson. And I think just in general in life, if you learn to see things that way of what can I gain from this? What is this trying to instruct me about with the world, with how I think, with my assumptions, with my insecurities, with my fucking character flaws, whatever? Learning to see everything as a potential lesson, I think, is one of the most empowering things you can do as a person in any endeavor. Last minute thoughts. Anybody wants to share with our wonderful audience who will totally immediately after this episode go give us a nice review?
Probably the thing I didn't hit on as much in the episode that I would call out lastly is if you're wrestling with shiny object syndrome, the first question I would ask myself is what's driving this? It's what Corey said, right? Is there an experience I'm avoiding? Is there something I'm wanting that's routing through it? So I would first inherently get curious about myself and my shiny object syndrome, and learn to get curious with that and then see what unfolds from there.
Aligned. I am aligned.
Okie doke. I guess we're done. To our awesome audience people, if you can, get a review. Share it with a friend. Share it publicly. Tweet about it. LinkedIn about it. Instagram about it. Whatever. Share it. All right. Until next time. Toodles.